Hello again, investors. Today we're going to look at an area called Droylesden, which is east of Manchester. An interesting area, in fact, and hopefully you'll find this video useful. All right then, let's get into it. As we do more of these videos, I'm going to do the scoring for them. And the idea is that we examine various key components that make an area good. So for example, location would be its proximity to somewhere, but also its accessibility, i.e. is it just close to things that people want? Demographics is really important in this whole story. I was going to say fantastically important, but it kind of is really, because demographics represents the people who you want to attract to the property you want to live in. And the rule with demographics is people like to be near people like themselves, and they try to move into the best area they can, and therefore demographics is fundamental. Crime, and then growth, and then we have sell time and rent time, and then finally yield, which is gross yield, i.e. the rental income into the advertised price of the property. Anyway, we add up all the scores as we go along, and as you see here, we end up with a score. So let's get into it and see what we can find. Now, the very first thing is location. So how long does it take to get into central Manchester? Well, if you're driving by car, around 20 minutes, and if it's public transport, around half an hour. So a good rule of thumb for me is whether a place is within 40 minutes, half an hour, 40 minutes public transport commute to a city centre. Obviously people are working, doing distributed workforce, and therefore quite often they're prepared to live further out. And you can see here on this travel time map for public transport for 45 minutes from Droylesden, you can get into the whole of central Manchester. This is method of travel to work. And here we have Droylesden. So the question is, how do most people get to work? And the answer is a lot of people are driving, and which surprises me a little bit because of its proximity to central Manchester. But you can see here, you don't have to go much closer to central Manchester, and then far lower proportion of people driving and a higher proportion using public transport, therefore, I assume. Okay, on location, there is one other question with location, and that is it a nice place? We know that it's close to the motorway, and is there green space? Is it nice? And the answer is yes, and it is very accessible. Now, you might notice I don't have a metric here which says nice, or is it a nice town? And that's because in the end I'm more interested in the type of people that want to live there, and whether the area works as buy to let. If people like it, they live there. So it is nice by their definition. So I'm not going to judge and say whether I think it's nice. But let's talk about location. I'm going to judge on location, and I'm going to say it's a 3.5. I think it's good. It could be slightly more central, but overall I think it's a good spot. Now let's look at demographics. And this is a big topic, and in my view, really, really important. Now, as I've explained in other videos, what we're looking for are people who can pay their rent on time and pay the money that you need them to pay to make your buy-to-let property work as a viable deal. And these would be the C1 social grade. You could aim for B's or A's, but typically those people are more likely to own their own property. And this is especially the case in the north of England, where property prices are relatively much more accessible to people earning a good income. Therefore, So anyway, we go back to the demographic map and let's look at the proportion of DE and C1. So C1 we'll start with, and you can see that actually Droylesden has lots of C1s, and this is very, very encouraging because these are the kind of people that want to rent. And if you remember, people like to be near people like themselves. Fact. And we see this constantly. So I'll show you social grade AB, for example. And I've shown you this. I've shown you this on other maps. But here's a classic, actually. You can see you've got a railway, I think that is. It looks like a railway. Or it's a road. But whatever it is, it's a divider between the rich side and the poor side. And same with Manchester and so on. Now, going back to Droylesden, I'm going to just go in a little bit closer on demographics and show you some of our data and the way we've interpreted this information. And the higher the number, the less social grade DE there is. And broadly speaking, that means it's a better off area. Generally speaking, C1s don't tend to rent via social housing, and therefore they tend to avoid these areas. So if we look back at the map here, the social housing is very integrated with the rest of the population, so that's great. For contrast, if you look at Ashton-under-Lyne, which is just down the road, you can see that there are large areas where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of social housing. This whole area is essentially a tract of it. But Droylesden, different story. So demographically, it works very well, and I'm going to give it a good score in demographics. I'm going to give it a 4. You know what? I'm going to go even higher than that. I'm going to give it a 4.5. Okay, let's look at crime. Now, with crime, it's very easy to generalize and say, oh, it's a high crime area or high crime town, must avoid. But as you'll see here, crime tends to be quite isolated. So, for example, we've got a big Tesco, we've got 11 crimes, which is actually relatively low, I've got to say. We've got some sort of high street issue, 12 crimes here. Now, when I've studied different areas for crime, I will say that in a big shopping area like this, in an area that's like quite downtrodden, say Ashton-under-Lyne or some places like that, then you would expect to see maybe 35, 40 crimes committed in a place like this over a year-long period. So actually, that's quite encouraging. Now, if we look in some of the quieter areas, because that's the place that people want to live, we can see here that actually there's just not that much crime. There is crime on a high traffic area, but that's fine. We've got something here which is slightly concerning, and this is obviously there's some issue here. Now, this is a good example of where I would avoid. It should be quiet. Why is there so much crime? Something's not right here, and therefore for this little patch I would avoid. But just down the street, not a problem. Okay, let's give this a crime score. I'm going to say the higher the number, the better it is on crime, by the way, not the lower crime. It's the other way around. That's my scoring system. Higher is better. I'm going to give that a 4 because actually in overall terms it's doing all right. You can have very high crime, very rich areas, and conversely you can have very low crime, poor areas. Okay, now the next thing is we're going to look at capital growth. This is a big topic, and as ever, what we'll start with is long-term capital growth. This is house price affordability over the last 170 years or thereabouts. And in 2007, property prices had a peak in affordability terms. In other words, property was really quite unaffordable, and last time it was as unaffordable on average across the UK was around 1895. Very different world back then. Therefore, it's a good long-term frame of reference for how local economy is done in the longer term. And what's interesting about Droylesden is that it's not kept up with inflation. So in other words, if you had bought a property back in 2007 for £100,000, in today's money, if you adjust it for inflation, i.e. purchasing power, so you have 2007 purchasing power, you can buy stuff for it back then what can you buy the equivalent stuff today? It would cost you 140,000. So the question is, how's that area doing on long-term inflation? And the answer is not great, but not bad. Now, there are some other numbers we should be looking at here, and this is I'll just hide a few layers just to make it more easy for you to understand. Let's have a look then at the shorter term growth, and actually that's been very strong. That's 31%. In other words, you bought 5 years ago, you are 31% richer in real inflation adjusted terms if you bought there. And same here. Here is 45%. So this is very strong. Whereas you move over here and you can see that this little patch not doing so good. That gives you some sense of the 5-year picture. Let's have a look at the 1-year picture and see how hot an area is. Now, this is relatively hot. If you have properties going up by 8-10% a year, that's huge. If you look at the average asking price, which is around 170,000, and you say that the demographic is good, it's a nice low crime area, the long-term capital growth has been reasonable, i.e. it hasn't overcooked. An area like this, because of its proximity and its historic growth and so on, I'm actually very confident that this patch will continue growing even in an economic downturn, i.e. a future with relatively high inflation, relatively low interest rates, and the rich getting richer as the UK economy shifts from being tied into Europe and having to reinvent itself. And therefore, on capital growth, I'm going to give it a high score because I actually have a lot of confidence in Droylesden, and I'm going to give it a 4. Sell time and rent time, we can do these ones pretty quickly. All right, so to explain what we're looking at, on the sales time, this is the percentage of sales, percentage of properties sold per month based on total stock. You've got 100 properties on the market, that 12 get sold, and that may seem low to you, but the way the data is collected, it's based on properties being shown on the property portals, and when a property is listed as sold subject to contract, then it can hang around for months as it goes through its processes. Also, a lot of properties are just in bad locations or overpriced or have some other issue, and you might talk like 50% of properties perhaps, and they hang around for a really long time and they bring the averages down. So when I see 12%, I'm thinking that's quite a hot market actually. A good property will be put under offer probably within 2 weeks or less, I would say. Now, turnover rental, this is a very high number, and this is 85% of stock rented out per month. Or in other words, if you've got a good property, you'll rent it out in probably 2 or 3 weeks maximum. It's a very hot area. And if we move further into Manchester, 71%. And if we move out to where we have some data, OL6, 60%. So Droylesden is hot for rentals. So for sell time, arguably there's a balance. If an area is so red hot, then it's just difficult to get a bite at the right properties. So it's an odd thing. It's kind of like a curve where if it's really slow, it's an avoid because there's something wrong with the local market, and if it's really hot, it's just too competitive. For me, this is a 3.5. It's hot, it's not over hot. Rent time, My goodness, that's a 4.5. It's absolutely flying out. Okay, so now the next question is yield, and then we get the final score. Let's dig into this one. Big topic and quite nuanced, to use a word. So we have a data set which has historic properties from propertydata.co.uk, one of our main data providers. These guys are really good, and I get this raw data. We've built a big algorithm, and then we feed all of that information into the system. We work out what we think is a sensible yield for a given property. The magic number is 5.2%. And the reason being that if you get above 5.2%, you pass the bank stress test to get a 75% loan to value mortgage, which then means you can really gear up if you have that kind of risk appetite. What I'm interested in is lots of like 5.7s, etc. And what I care for are like 3-bedroom properties, this kind of thing. So let's have a look at this one. 6.6, 910. I think you could pick something up, a 2-bedroom terraced, for a real yield of above 5.2. I think these yields are good. Now, again, with yields, it's kind of like you got a U curve. And the reason for that is that if yields are spectacularly high, like 8-9%, something like that, generally speaking, you're going to get a bad demographic. When I think about yields, I think about risk and yield. The risk of getting voids based on a high yield. You can have a very bad area, very high yield, very high risk of void, because the people who will rent there, if you get the rental, will be economically precarious. So therefore you kind of make a compromise, and the compromise is something around a sensible yield like 5.2, where you're not going all the way, but the numbers basically work. And overall, let's get back into it. So let's give it a yield number. I'm going to give it a 4 on yield. I think there are some good deals in Droylesden, and I think it on a load of levels, I think this area works well. So let's see what the scores are. It's come out overall as a very strong area. I'm really pleased about that score. And the reason I am is because we had a client recently who bought a property there, and all the numbers worked on the property. We liked the area, and this is the first time I've done like a kind of methodical, balanced scorecard approach on Droylesden. And it's come out as I had actually expected, which is great. So that's good news if you believe in the scoring system. I do. So anyway, I hope you like that. And if you like, please like. And if you want more of this kind of thing, please subscribe. And until next time, good investing.